Shoutouts this week to some younger listeners. A few college professors and parents have told us that they've shared our podcast with college students who have become regular listeners. So here's a shout out to Amanda from Michigan State, Jonathan from Syracuse, and Miranda from the University of Dayton. We're excited to bring you today's episode about a relatively unknown story of bravery, heroism, and compassion from inside a German concentration camp during World War II. It's the kind of story you've told us you like. Please let us know if you like this and if you want to hear more episodes like it. Send your thoughts to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com. If you want, we can give you a shout out. As always, thank you for being a listener to the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. What was it about Witold that attracted you to his story?
That's a great question, Tim. I am a war reporter by background, and in 2011, I'd spent about 10 years covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was sitting with a war reporter friend, and he had just come back on assignment from Auschwitz, writing an anniversary story, and he'd read about the camp resistance, and I found the idea that resistance was possible in Auschwitz to be quite mind-blowing. I saw Auschwitz as this place of great victimhood and of great suffering, and the discovery that a small band of men were at the very center of the German death factory fighting back against the Nazis was really compelling. The next year, I found that Pilecki's story, his report, was finally translated into English, a very raw, fascinating document that outlines his mission to the camp. For me, I was totally drawn in. Pilecki was, my age. He also had 2 kids. He volunteered for this mission. I felt, very strongly compelled to follow his story and to try and answer some of the questions that his report doesn't answer, such as, what in the world happened to the reports that he smuggled out of the camp? Why didn't the Allies react to his reporting? And why do we not know his story now?
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Jack Fairweather. He's the author of a riveting true story about one man who had the courage to break into a German concentration camp in World War II. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Jack about the story of Witold Pilecki. He was a second lieutenant in the Polish army during World War II. He took on one of the most daunting assignments anyone would take in the war. He volunteered to be taken prisoner to fight the war from inside a German concentration camp. The camp he would call home was Auschwitz. The book is called The Volunteer. Think about this for a second. He's the only known voluntary inmate of Auschwitz. He spent 2.5 years as a member of the resistance gathering intelligence from the German army during World War II. From inside a concentration camp. Now let that sink in. Witold Pilecki was a member of the Polish army, and on September 19, 1940, he intentionally allowed himself to be arrested by the Nazis. After that, he was detained with roughly 1,800 Polish political prisoners, and then he was taken to Auschwitz. He would be imprisoned for the next 2.5 years. To his captors, he was nothing more than prisoner 4859. Here's what happened. Witold, a Catholic, had already served in the Polish army, and he married a local schoolteacher named Maria before hostilities started. They had 2 children. He ran the family farm. He painted. He wrote poetry and lived a quiet life. In 1939, he was called back to military service when the Nazis invaded Poland. Poland was quickly defeated and was occupied by the German army. After that, Witold found his way to Warsaw to serve as part of the underground resistance against the Nazis. Not long after that, in August of 1940, the Nazis had captured a group of political opponents from Poland and transported them to Auschwitz. It didn't take long before the families of those prisoners were notified of their deaths. The Polish underground suspected murder, but they needed more information. That was when Witold Pilecki volunteered to investigate from the inside. And after 2.5 years, he would escape and write a 100-page report on life inside the Auschwitz death camp. Jack, what was Witold trying to accomplish when he first volunteered to break into that concentration camp?
So Auschwitz, when it first opened, was designed by the Nazis for Polish political prisoners. It became the collecting point for European Jewry later. So I mean, it's a really important point to make early on. It was new to me when I first came to the story, the idea that it was a more sort of regular concentration camp. I use regular with, in quotation marks. So it had opened in June 1940 for Polish prisoners, and rumors had begun to circulate around the country that it was a place of particular brutality. The underground in Warsaw, of which Pilecki was a member, wanted to find out more. What was this place? What were the Nazis trying to do there? And that's when they turned to Pilecki and said, would you be prepared to go to the camp, to infiltrate it, to allow yourself to be arrested and sent there? It's a completely extraordinary request, because even though it wasn't the death factory that it became, it was still a Nazi concentration camp with a very bad reputation. So Pilecki had to use great courage to accept the mission.
According to your book, his mission was to raise morale of Polish political prisoners by bringing news from outside the camp, as well as to report camp conditions to the Home Army in Warsaw. And that begs the question, and you kind of said it earlier when you talked about the security of Auschwitz. How did they expect to get information out of Auschwitz to the outside world?
So when Pilecki arrived in the camp, he had this mission to gather evidence of Nazi crimes, perhaps to stage a breakout, certainly to rally a resistance cell in the camp. His first few hours in the camp was so brutal and so horrific that he, like a lot of the prisoners arriving with him, were just, shell-shocked. That was, of course, the Nazis' intention, that you haze the prisoners, you beat them, pummel them, strip them, shave them, give them numbers instead of names, all part of this terrible process of dehumanization, and that was to turn them into pliant forced labor. Pilecki quickly realized that he would have to survive, and that actually the first mission of any underground that he might have would be to help other prisoners. And it's one of the amazing parts of the research was discovering one of his very first acts of recruitment with one of the other prisoners, a chap called Konstanty Pilecki. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the book, because it really sort of captures that moment early on in the camp. They're standing outside one of the blocks in the evening. It's they've got a little window before curfew. They've just been doing back-breaking labor. Pilecki's been working, building the crematorium, the camp's crematorium. They're covered in bruises and welts. They're on starvation rations. Pilecki taps Pilecki on the shoulder and leads him away from the other prisoners and says, will you join the underground? And Pilecki looks at him and says, to paraphrase, are you nuts? Look at us. We're in no position to resist the Nazis in this condition. And then something happens that I think is really sort of unlocks the key to one of the keys to Pilecki's success. Pilecki begins to realize that what Pilecki had offered him, the secret of the underground, was also the secret of his life, that Pilecki could in that moment have turned around and betrayed Pilecki to one of the German functionaries that ran the camp, or to the SS, and got a loaf of bread out of it. But he realized that Pilecki had trusted him with something that was greater than themselves, greater than their own simple impulse to survive in the camp. And that sort of act of trust, that belief that something greater than themselves could survive in the camp, was really the sort of secret of the underground, and propelled Pilecki to the next step, which was to turn, the small group of men that he brought together into an offensive force for attacking the Nazis, for sabotaging their operations, for assassinating SS men, and of course for gathering the intelligence that would persuade the Allies to intervene. And that presented Pilecki with the challenge of how do you get a message out of the camp. And Pilecki, one of the things I just love about him as a man was just his continuous ingenuity and creativity. He was always on the lookout in Auschwitz for solutions to problems. And what he discovered was that there was a prisoner who was about to be released from the camp this is in the autumn, the fall of 1940. Occasionally, a few prisoners were released if their families paid the right bribes in Warsaw. And he learned of the identity of the man and prepared an oral report for him to carry. Of course, there was no question of writing down a list of the Nazi crimes at that point. So this released prisoner took then Pilecki's message to Warsaw upon his release. And in the book, I then chart the extraordinary story of what happened to that message, how it was smuggled across occupied Europe and then finally reached London and Allied commanders.
I'd like to go back for a second to another part of your book that kind of sets the stage, that you talked about the hazing process. And to use hazing is to put it mildly, because it was right after Pilecki gets off the train or soon after he's at the camp, and he sees a column of political prisoners get off the train. And what do the German guards do to them?
They sort of are corralling them towards the gates. Arbeit macht frei, those terrible words, works sets you free, which iron trellis over the gateway. Pilecki's confused. He's sort of staggering around. The German guards suddenly call out one of the prisoners and orders him to run away from the column. And the man, confused, does it, and the German guard then guns him down. Then they drag 10 more prisoners out and shoot them. And, Pilecki and the other prisoners are all standing just stock still, horrified. The march then begins again. The bodies are being dragged by the other prisoners at the rear of the column. That's their introduction to Auschwitz.
So that kind of creates the atmosphere in the book and in the whole story. You understand that this is real when you see this. And you look at that against that backdrop, all of the other things that you talk about, there's this ever-present threat of death. And kind of tied to that, what you just mentioned, when he met his first partner in the resistance inside the camp, you said that he had been working on a crematorium all day. Did Witold know what that crematorium would be used for?
It was one of the first speeches by the SS deputy commandant. The next morning, they're all gathered in the roll call square. It's one of the rituals of the camp that the prisoners were gathered at 3 times a day to be counted, and they're all gathered at dawn. And the deputy commandant, an SS officer called Karl Fritsch, announces to them, look, over there, and he points towards the smokestack beyond the buildings where the smoke is rising, and he says, that's your only way out of this camp. Up the smoke of the crematorium chimney. Pilecki's job was to help insulate the crematorium, because the SS, they'd only just installed the first ovens in the camp when Pilecki arrived, but they weren't burning the bodies quickly enough, and so they needed to insulate the building with stone and gravel to help improve the burn rate. A rather grim job indeed. And so when Pilecki carried his first barrel of gravel towards the crematorium, it was already smoking. There are no exact figures for how many prisoners were being killed at that point, but it was probably about a dozen or more a day. So the crematorium was usually in operation daily.
And that's just the crematorium, because as you had mentioned, that he had these reports to get out. Witold had a mission. He had to get information. He had to get information that he could then report. Some things he witnessed. He witnessed some of the pain suffered by other prisoners. He saw prisoners disappear. He saw other prisoners disappear, and he just could assume that they were then executed and eliminated. But he also learned about other things that were happening at that camp that became part of his reports. He learned about experiments that involved other prisoners, that the SS and the Nazis were conducting on prisoners. Many of these people who were experimented on died from their injuries. How did Witold find out about these experiments that the Germans were conducting on other prisoners?
Well, he witnessed them very, very directly. One of the crucial elements of Pilecki's story and why it's so historically important is that the camp became a site for experimentation by the Nazis, experiments that led them step by step. They didn't have a plan for the final solution, but they were led step by step through these experiments towards the logic of mass murder. And the conditions in the camp that first winter were so appalling. The lack of food, disease became rampant, the brutality in the shootings, that pretty soon almost a fifth of the camp population of about 8,000 prisoners was incapacitated. The camp had this hospital, so-called, on its, within the wire, where prisoners who couldn't work were sort of warehoused. There was no medicine. The hospital was just was for show by the SS. And the numbers of sick and incapacitated prisoners was such that it presented a real problem to the SS who ran the camp. One solution, obviously, would have been to start feeding the prisoners better and to care for them. That wasn't what they did. Instead, they started experimenting with ways to euthanize the sick. And those were some of the first experiments that Pilecki witnessed and reported on. The hospital had a number of prisoner inmates who worked as nurses, bathing occasionally the sick and administering the tiny amount of medicine that they had. And they were telling him, look, the SS doctors are coming in here, they're injecting prisoners with petrol, with prussic acid, just different ways to try and kill them. And those grim early experiments set the stage then for additional experiments, efforts to kill more prisoners more quickly. And by the summer of 1941, the first gas experiments were taking place in the camp.
Who were the victims of those experiments? Were they the political prisoners, or were these Jewish people at that time?
This was still sick prisoners. The first gas experiment took place in the basement of the penal block in the camp. There were 250 sick patients, and also 600 odd Soviet POWs who'd been captured on the front. By that stage, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, and hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners were being directed back towards Germany to be used as forced labor. The first ones that were brought to Auschwitz were taken to the basement of the penal block along with the sick prisoners, and the SS put some pesticide in the rooms that was used to kill lice in the camp, called Zyklon B, and it was used to gas the prisoners. Again, it's one of the scenes in the book that I think really brings home the nature of Pilecki's active witnessing. All the prisoners are in their blocks. It's happening late at night. They hear the men's screams. Prisoner nurses the next day drag the bodies out through the camp. I mean, it's just this horrific, brutal scene. And of course, for Pilecki, it's this call to arms to, report, to start planning an uprising. They realize that they've got to stop what the Nazis are carrying out in the camp.
Well, that's the interesting thing about Witold. An individual human being has a decision to make when they see what he saw. And he responded not through fear, but through action. It does beg the question, how did he fare during all of this? I know that you mentioned he was beaten. He had his share of beatings and he lost teeth. How often was he punished in that way, and how did he manage not to get killed?
That's a great question, and it was a mixture of luck and I think something else. Just this eye he had for resistance. It's one of the reasons why his mission saved so many lives in the camp, because it gave prisoners the belief that they had a purpose there. They weren't simply victims. They weren't simply there to be killed. And it was very powerful for Pilecki himself, tool of survival. He describes in that first autumn in the camp, he's starving to death. He's sort of marching back from his work detail, staggering, almost losing consciousness. And yet he keeps saying this mantra over and over again, I'm not going to die. I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight. I'm not going to die. And that really keeps him going, along with this eye for opportunity, which, opportunities for his men, opportunities, for himself. That's what it took to survive in the camp. He describes in his report the moment when he got a job indoors, and this was an important feature of most prisoners who were able to survive the camp. They were able to find jobs in the camp administration, working as prisoners, working away from the sort of murderous hard labor details. And Pilecki describes how he sees one of the German functionaries, the German prisoners who ran the camp, running towards his group. And Pilecki, just on a spur of the moment, steps towards him, and the man says, "You're not by any chance a stove fitter?" And Pilecki, of course, is not a stove fitter. He was a gentleman farmer from eastern Poland and an officer. But anyway, he says, "Yes, I am a stove fitter." And the man says, "Quickly, come with me." And it seems there was an urgent job that the SS needed to be carried out. Some senior officer needed a stove fitted in his new apartment, and Pilecki got a respite for some days whilst he installed the stove, a chance to catch his breath, to husband his resources, and then return back to the camp. And so that was one of the ways in which he personally survived. As the camp expanded, he found slots for his men in lots of different work details. Those prisoners who in turn were able to sort of help soften the blows, help find and shelter prisoners. The hospital itself became a place of refuge for the underground. Some of the prisoner doctors there were able to shelter injured men for a time. So little by little, as the underground grew in size and complexity, they found ways to shelter members. And by the summer of 42, at the point when Pilecki was seriously thinking about a camp uprising, there was over 1,000 men in the underground.
Well, that actually brings me to another one of my questions. I mean, the underground has grown. As you mentioned, there's 1,000 people a part of it. Their activities weren't just to get information, but at one point, they built a radio transmitter from smuggled parts. And apparently, they got the parts by bribing German guard capos and other things that they've done, so that there were certain relationships between the guards and the prisoners at that point in time that allowed the underground to grow. But at the same time, when you have 1,000 people in the underground, there's a much higher risk of the German authorities finding out. How did they keep it such a secret?
That's a great question. And part of the answer lies in the Germans' own view of the prisoners. They were Polish prisoners, therefore they were, racially they were seen as inferior and Untermensch, subhuman. It took a long time for the SS to credit them with the ability to organize a resistance. The camp commandant, Rudolf Höss, believed that at most the prisoners were capable of organizing themselves into gangs, prison gangs. It wasn't until the impact of some of the reports that Pilecki smuggled out started to land that he began to realize, a good year and a half into the resistance, that there was some unorganized and quite dangerous organization in their midst. Of course, they still couldn't crack it. And the best evidence of this was the method by which they sought to crack down on the underground, and that was simply just to round up prisoners who had past resistance records from Warsaw or who had a military background and just shoot them summarily. They didn't know the network. They didn't crack the network. But of course, just by shooting 100 guys at once, Pilecki lost, valuable men this way. And, I think some of that incredible tension and fear really among the prisoners starts to boil over in 42, just as the Holocaust is beginning. The SS are cracking down on the underground. Pilecki and his inner circle are, desperate to launch this uprising. And as you mentioned, they, even go as far as stealing a radio and setting up their own radio station, sort of beaming out messages, imploring for action, calling on, the Allies to help, letting them know what's happening in the camp, hoping for the response, hoping for intervention.
There was another part of the book where the underground took a stance against escape attempts. The reason they did that was because there was this group punishment, so that you had just mentioned that if the guards decided that they were going to send a message, they would round people up and kill them or torture them. So at some point, the guards eventually stopped this group punishment. Do you know why they stopped doing it? Did they just determine that it wasn't effective?
Pilecki mentions in his report that one of the prisoners who worked as a clerk in the SS headquarters, where of course he had planted a man, had seen a letter saying that these collective punishments had caused concern among the German military because they feared that the Allies would themselves carry out collective punishment against German prisoners of war. There's no documentary evidence to suggest that is accurate. There's no SS documents to sort of back that up. that was Pilecki's belief, and certainly it was the case that when prisoners escaped from early 42 onwards, there weren't the same sort of punishments as there had been earlier on. So that was Pilecki's surmise. Whatever the real reason, it does seem to have been the case, and it encouraged him to then organize these extraordinary escapes, which some of the most amazing in Allied history of escapes from German prisoners of war camps.
Pilecki was one of those people then who orchestrated a number of escapes, and there was one occasion where he was actually part of the plan to escape himself, but he decided not to escape. He decided to give his place in the escape to another inmate. That inmate was at higher risk, he felt, so he decided to let that person take his place. That was just another one of those character things with him, wasn't it? That he put someone else before himself. He put the mission before himself. And he put the country and the organization before himself.
That's right, and I think he felt incredibly personally invested in the Underground's success. I mean, at one point, relatively early on, actually, as this trickle of prisoners was being released, it suddenly crossed his mind, oh no, what happens if my family, by the way, he kept the mission completely secret from them to protect them. What happens if my family tries to get me released? And one of the messages he had to smuggle out with the released prisoner was a message to his wife saying, please don't get me out of the camp, which seems completely extraordinary. But when you realize that Pilecki had begun to realize, in some ways, I think before anyone, Auschwitz was the tip of the spear. It was this utterly crucial site in the Nazis' totalitarian grip on Europe, and that what he was doing there was of crucial importance in fighting back against the Nazis. It kept him in the camp. He had multiple opportunities to attempt an escape, and he stuck it out for as long as he felt that there was a chance that they could destroy Auschwitz.
Pilecki would escape Auschwitz in April of 1943, and apparently he decided to escape this time because key members of his underground organization were sent to other concentration camps, and he started to feel that he would get the same transfer to somewhere else. So he felt that his purpose at Auschwitz was limited and becoming less effective, and he thought he might be able to help the war effort in other ways, and he would do that, wouldn't he? He and two others had only one night to carry out their plans. So can you describe how Witold Pilecki finally decided to escape that prison?
Well, let me just back up one small step and say that Pilecki set up this incredible underground, worked out where the reserve arms supplies were that they needed to raid in order to arm the prisoners, had worked out which railway bridges to destroy to sort of cripple any response and stop the transports arriving in the camp. And there's this moment when a prisoner enters the camp. He's just arrived. He's from the headquarters in Warsaw. He'd been rounded up with a whole bunch of other men. And Pilecki recognizes him and says, so what about my reports? What about this uprising plan? And the guy just looks at him and just says, that we're not thinking about helping uprising in Auschwitz. You guys are just a bag of bones. We've got bigger problems coming with as the Soviets advance towards Poland. And Pilecki is he's just floored by that revelation, probably one that he must have suspected on some level, 2 years on in his time in the camp. But nonetheless, to hear it sort of confirmed by a man close to the underground leadership was devastating for him. And it was at this point that I think, he began to become overwhelmed with a sense of guilt really. The Holocaust was just beginning. The trains were arriving every single day in the camp, 1,000 or more Jewish families being gassed. Pilecki was working in warehouse where the shoes and the luggage of the murdered Jews was being processed. And he describes this harrowing moment that winter, having realized that Allied help isn't coming, that the underground is seemingly unmoved by his pleas. And he sees a family standing outside the main gate crematorium, and it's a small group, and they lock eyes, and Pilecki knows they're about to be killed, and the family, he can realize that they're about to be killed. And he sees a 10-year-old boy, same age as his son at the time, and he just walks by, hears then muffled shots a few minutes later, and that night he just lies in his cot, racked by guilt and by this sense of shame that for all of their talk, all of their efforts, he had not been able to save the life of a single child. And this really forms this powerful desire to leave the camp, and of course to escape the camp, in order to make one final effort to persuade the underground, the Allies, to attack it. And it's a moment of extreme risk. He had organized some escapes, but it's worth pointing out that there are almost 1,000 escapes from the camp, of which barely 100 were successful, and that's over the whole 5 years of the camp. So it was extremely fraught and dangerous operation. He racked his brains for a successful escape plan. At one stage, really sort of captures his mood. He was trying to see if there was a route via the sewers. He found a manhole cover close to his block that he would sneak out to at night, and then spend the whole night crawling through the prisoners' excrement looking for an escape channel. Suffice to say that there wasn't a route that way. And finally he hit upon this idea of joining a prisoner detachment working at a bakery just outside the camp. And it was from that building with two other men in April 1943 on the night shift that he escaped. They forged the key to the bakery. The men were all locked in there, but with that forged key, they managed to open the door, and in just a few split seconds that they had, dashed away. The guards were quickly on their heels, shooting after them, but they managed to escape by the cover of darkness. Of course, getting away from those guards, being outside the camp, he still had an extraordinary 100-mile sort of escapade to get across occupied Poland to a safe house that where he knew he could shelter. I write about it in the book. It's really one of these just extraordinary journeys where you're sort of nail biting as you go through it, because there are so many twists and turns as he makes his way across Poland, and has then this final attempt to rally a force to attack the camp.
Well, that was one of the other things that he did. After he escaped, and you said that was about 100 miles on foot, and it took them about a week to get to what they might have felt was relative safety. At that point, Witold Pilecki wasn't finished. He decided that he would fight in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 near the end of the war, and they lost again this time. This time he was captured and sent to another prison camp in Germany, so this is the second time that he becomes a prisoner. But near the end of the war, the prison camp that he was in was liberated, and he would once again re-engage in the effort. This time he was sent to Italy to fight as part of the Polish armed forces. And that is where one of the big events happens in his life and in his contribution to the effort. What did he write in Italy that made it possible for you to write the book that you wrote and for everyone to know who he is?
Well, he wrote a report, a memoir really, describing his time in the camp. It's a really extraordinary document, which I encourage your listeners to go and read. It's very raw, it's very honest, it's brutal, describing his time in the camp and the nature of his mission. It's the main document by which we know of Pilecki. What happened then was he decided to go back to fight against the communists who took over Poland at the end of World War II. And this document that he wrote, he handed it off to a member of the underground in Italy, who then kept it safe, brought it to London. And that document was finally accessed in the late 60s by a Polish historian. What happened to Pilecki, and the reason why we don't know his story more widely, is that upon returning to fight the communists, he was captured and executed, and all of his wartime record deleted from history. He wrote other reports. He wrote another memoir about his early life, all of which were locked away in communist military archives up until the 90s. And as I said at the beginning, it wasn't until 2012 that that longer report that made it to London was finally translated into English. It wasn't until the mid-90s that those documents in Warsaw that also shed amazing light onto Pilecki's story were finally liberated from the archives in Warsaw by Pilecki's family. These were the documents that sort of initially guided me on the research, but what I found really amazing as I began looking into the story was that there were still men and women who had fought with Pilecki, who had known him intimately, who were alive in Warsaw when I began research in 2016. And some of them had never spoken about their families, about their experiences before. They'd never spoken about their families' connection to Pilecki, either because they dared not to, or simply because people hadn't asked them, just because of this unfortunately successful communist effort to obliterate Pilecki's memory meant that he was harbored only in the memories of a few, and people couldn't connect with their stories with each other. They couldn't commemorate his bravery. And so I had this incredible opportunity to speak to many, I think, none more amazing than Witold's son and daughter, who were both alive. His nephew, who was in the room when Pilecki volunteered for the camp. And one of the things I tried to do with the research was to follow in Pilecki's footsteps as much as possible. But even better was when I could bring someone who could remember the scene along with the journey. And I took Marek, the name of Witold's nephew, back to the apartment where Witold volunteered, where he sat waiting for the Germans to sort of burst into the room and seize him. And it was the first time that Marek, he was 86 when I met him, had been back to the apartment, and the communists had taken it at the end of the war. And it was just unbelievable to see him relive the scene. He remembered that moment when German steps were on the stairs, there were shouts and gunshots, and he remembered a detail that Pilecki got up from bed, getting ready to walk into captivity, and he spotted Marek's teddy bear on the floor. Marek was, wide-eyed in his little cot, obviously terrified, and Pilecki reached down, picked up the teddy bear and handed it to Marek. And it's one of those sort of details that really speak about Pilecki's ability to look beyond himself in moments of huge stress. A moment later, the door burst open and the Germans were seizing him and dragging him out to the streets. And I tried as much as possible to connect following in Poleckis's footsteps with those who remembered for his meeting him or working with him. I recreated his escape. The best way to answer some of the questions of, how in the world did Poleckis manage to do that was simply to try and do it oneself. And so I staged my own sort of escape from the camp on the same day and the same hour, albeit 80 years later, and not having been a prisoner for 2.5 years. But anyway, followed Poleckis's route as best I could recreate it from his report. And it was incredibly moving, because as I went along on this 100-mile journey to a couple of the villages that he name-checked in his report, I encountered families that had actually sheltered him, and found the children, who now in their late 80s, who actually remembered the moment when this gaunt, shaven-headed man with the 2 other prisoners came into their families' homes. And it was very touching to be sheltered by them in turn and supported on my journey that culminated in the safe house where Poleckis spent 3 months trying to rally a mission to attack the camp. That house still stands. The daughter is still alive, who remembers Poleckis being there in the house. So it was just one of those moments when you realize that this story is still very present. It really did happen. It's not, far away from us. It's this man, was flesh and blood, and if we reach out just a little bit, we can connect with him and his extraordinary story.
Jack, you mentioned that he was an opportunist, and that seemed to be part of the key to his survival. And when we hear the word opportunist, we think of almost a selfish motive. But there's another story you just said, and it was when you talked about right before he was taken captive, he picked up that stuffed animal and gave it to his nephew. And it makes me wonder if there's a connection between the two, and that the opportunity that he was looking for wasn't for himself, but in that incident where he picked up that stuffed animal, and in all of these other incidents where he saved people and he had himself taken prisoner 3 times, was that opportunity for him always to find human dignity in all of this horror and tragedy?
I think that's very beautifully put. And I think that was one of the things that, in speaking to those who knew him, comes across very strongly, that he had a rare ability to trust other people. And I think that had revolutionary potential in the Nazi order of things. They were trying to break down the bonds between people, to separate people, to dehumanize them, turn them into slave labor. And Pilecki found in those around him, even prisoners who had cracked somewhat and were, become part of the camp machinery, he still found ways to connect with people, find those, the dignity in them. And that became the basis of the camp underground. And I think it's also one of the, the messages from the book that can really resonate today, because I feel like there is the question where are the Witolds now? How are we responding to injustice and atrocities around us? I think Pilecki gives us an example of how to respond in times of crisis by reaching out and connecting to others.
Jack Fairweather, thank you for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure, Tim. Thank you for your questions, and I hope that Poleckis's story can inspire your readers as it has inspired me for the past 4 years and following in his footsteps.
To learn more about Jack Fairweather's book about Witold Pilecki called The Volunteer and other information we talked about today, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion. Or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.